All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to our webinar, The Future of Buying 3ds Max for E-commerce. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. My name is Audrey Sullivan and I'm a marketing manager for Autodesk's media and entertainment team. With me today are two wonderful presenters, 3ds Max technical specialist Jose Manuel Elizardo and 3ds Max senior product owner Bruno Landry. Over the next hour, they'll be taking you through the benefits and associated workflows of transitioning to a digital asset creation pipeline using 3ds Max. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items, although I'm sure you're all well acquainted with Zoom at this point. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A pop-out at the bottom of your screen. We also encourage live feedback and discussion via the chat feature. This session is being recorded and will be sent out via email in the next few days. You'll also be able to find the recording on our YouTube page. Finally, just like many of you, our entire team is currently working from home. While we've taken steps to ensure a smooth webinar, we do ask that you bear with us through any technical difficulties we may experience. With that, I think we're ready to get started. Jose and Bruno, take it away.
Thanks, Audrey. So first of all, do you guys hear me loud and clear? Audrey, Bruno, Brent?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, let's jump right in.
And maybe just mention that Brent is also on the call. So Brent is also a product owner on the Max team. He's kind of highly knowledgeable about e-commerce, so feel free to engage with us.
Yeah, at the last minute, we felt that somebody should be here that actually knows something about
Someone that actually knows something should be on the call.
Thanks, Brent.
Thanks, Brent.
But this is their show. I'd love to take it away.
We're just a messenger. You make the stuff that looks cool. So with that, we're going to jump right in. We have a pretty packed agenda and lots of content to show. In fact, if we were to show everything we could show, we'd probably go on for 2 hours. So we did a big job of stripping things down and showing you basically the most important stuff. Just a quick intro about some of the speakers here today. So myself, my name is Jose Elizardo. You've probably seen some of my videos online. I have a YouTube channel. I've been working with Autodesk for 14 years, going on 14 years. I've done lots of different roles at Autodesk, and I've been in this role for the past 8 years. So pre-COVID, I was field-based, which means I travel a lot and I visit customers in the US and Canada across all the divisions that Max is a part of. So that's design, visualization, of course, games and VFX. And with me today, I have my partner in crime, or Bruno Landry, who I'll let introduce himself.
Yeah, so my name is Bruno. I joined Autodesk about 5 years ago, and for the last year, I'm kind of responsible for anything related to rendering on the Max team. So before to that, I was a Max user. I've used Max for almost 20 years, and actually have a background in industrial design. And somewhere during my career, I was exposed to 3ds Max. So if you want to go to the next slide, Jose.
Yep.
So I kind of decided to switch a bit my career and stop being a kind of a pure product designer. And I switched my career to be a CG artist. It was a kind of a family drama. And I work in the industry for multiple years, as I've mentioned, mostly in the product design world because of my background in industrial design, but also a bit in ArchViz, interior design, stuff like that. All right. So me and Jose, we usually, when it's possible, kind of travel the world and meet with our 3ds Max friends. So we usually on a regular basis go and meet with our customer. We do presentation together, attend to event, go to studios, big, small, meet all kind of user to kind of engage with them and get to know them a bit better. But this year it's slightly different. So we're kind of happy to be here online to engage with you.
And keep the connections alive.
Yes.
All right, so thanks for that, Bruno. So with that, we're going to jump a little bit into the agenda. This is what we have covered for you guys today. So we're going to start off a little bit from the high level perspective. So why are we talking about e-commerce? Why today? And why should you care? And why does this matter? Especially as it relates, of course, to the retail industry. Then we're going to get into some workflows that we have inside of 3ds Max that facilitate e-commerce output, so to speak. So we're going to talk about material management, of course. When it comes to representing a product in a digital way, I think if everything boils down to materials, you want to have rich looking, visual representations of those fabrics and those textures that you're creating for the products that you're making. So we have really nice ways of making that inside of Max. We're going to take a look at the viewport and how we've added a lot of enhancements into 3ds Max over the last several months, even year more or less, to really create that nice looked at viewport where you can make good informed decisions on what your models are going to look like before you hit the render engine. And in some case, even use those viewport snapshots as final product delivery. We're going to transition into digital photography, which is basically the idea of recreating a digital photo shoot, an actual physical photo shoot, but in a digital environment inside of 3ds Max. We have some post-processing that we're going to look at. And then we're going to see how to target multiple different output platforms based on, the single sort of model, single source of truth. When it comes to e-commerce, it's all about providing multiple different ways of experiencing the product before making an informed, to help inform the decision-making or to increase the viability of your product, whether it's photorealistic images, whether it's, an AR experience or being able to tumble your model in a web browser. And then we're going to close off with Bruno is going to come back and talk to us about what's coming in 3ds Max as it relates to these workflows that we're talking about here today.
Yeah, so it's mostly Jose's show, so I'll be there more to ask questions and see what's happening on the chat. But yeah, at the end I'm going to show a bit, what's cooking in the Max Kitchen and what's coming.
Don't if you're like a massive Bruno fan, like don't worry, we're going to sprinkle Bruno throughout the presentation. He's not just coming back at the end. We have some sprinkles of Bruno throughout. So for all you fans, don't worry about it. All right, so let's. I turned my camera off, by the way, to save some bandwidth. This is a large deck with lots of videos and lots of high resolution imagery. We want to make sure that you guys are getting the most out of it. So why are we talking about e-commerce? Why today? And more importantly, why should you care about all this? I think the first point I really want to make is that, the act of buying something online or going online and shopping and purchasing is really not relegated, to the ultra niche or a subset of the population as it once was, right? We've come a really long way. Folks like Amazon have helped democratize and bring online shopping to everybody. But I remember just like 20 years ago, you wouldn't even dream about putting your credit card online. And today we don't even think about it twice, right? So we've come a long way, and it's important to understand that it's really not just Sandra Bullock in her basement ordering pizza. Everyone and your grandmother is going online. And at the end of the day, it's important to make that point that your competitors are going online. If your business lends itself remotely in some shape or form to selling online, you really should be considering this right now. It's safe to assume that in a few years' time, online shopping it will outpace brick and mortar shopping or traditional in-store shopping. And there's lots of reasons why this is happening. Of course, the pandemic, which we'll talk about in a second, have helped accelerate this. But this was not this doesn't happen overnight. It's been in the making for a long time. I think maybe the pandemic has accelerated a certain part of it. We're maybe a few years into the future today, but nonetheless, this is not something that is new. And so you don't want to be upset about this and be left in the dirt like Drake is. By the way, Drake's our spirit animal. You're going to see him throughout the presentation in different shape and form. And so back to the pandemic and the reality that COVID has set in. I mean, like I said, pre-COVID, there was already a move to online shopping. That move would have probably taken a few more years, and the pandemic and the realities brought on by COVID have really accelerated that. More and more people are shopping and doing things and making decisions from the comforts of their living room without going into the stores. And yes, when the pandemic's over, this will kind of sort of subside a little bit, but online shopping is not going anywhere. If anything, what this has proven to us is that people can become comfortable with this. Once you become comfortable with something, there's no turning back, right? Yes, brick and mortar stores will still exist. They will also have a need for that, but it's not like we can say that online shopping will go away. It will not go away. People have gotten comfortable with putting their credit cards online. They've gotten comfortable with shopping online for lots of different reasons, and some of them we'll cover here today. But this is not a trend that's by any stretch of the imagination going away. If you look at any of the data coming out that's come out in the last few months, and it's funny because we're in such a fast-paced world right now, especially with the pandemic. 6 months ago feels like 10 months ago, and even 6 months ago, people weren't really expecting the move to online to happen that dramatically or that drastically. But all the data shows that it's outpacing brick and mortar in a lot of spaces. Now, what makes a successful online shopping experience? I mean, we know what's a bad online shopping. Here are just some examples that I pulled online. Of course, some of this is comical, but this is what you want to avoid at all costs. You don't want to have representations of your products that are not true to life. You want your experience online and what your customers come on your store to see to be as representative as possible. Here's an example of a really great online shopping experience. I'm not, being paid by Skullcandy by any means. I just think it's a really great shopping experience. In fact, I think, Bruno, correct me if I'm wrong, but they won awards for their website for their e-commerce extension. But this is a really great shopping experience. It's a really great example of the things to be considering. It's not just a fancy looking website, right? You can configure the product you're buying with the different colors and different schemes. Everything you're seeing with the product up at the top there is all 3D. These are all CG elements, picking and choosing different colors. When you scroll down, there's a bunch of rich information about what this product does and how it behaves. We're talking about videos, we're talking about descriptions, testimonials, you name it, right? So it's much more than just a rich website. It's a rich website that contains a lot of information that instills confidence into the buyer to make that buying decision. This helps convert browsers into buyers much more easily. I read a study last week that said that in 2016, the amount of images a consumer expected on any given product before they would make a purchasing decision was about 3 on average. In 2020, that number has jumped to 8. So, right, we're talking about lots of rich visual content to help tell that story. And just going off on a tangent just for a second here, we're focused a lot on the visual side of selling online and the visual assets needed to sell online. But I want to make a little bit of a kind of parenthesis here. There's a lot more that goes into extending your business online. It's not really only about creating imagery. Imagery is a big part of it, and creating representations or realistic representations of your models and the products you're selling. But it's a lot more that goes into that. You got to have a transactional website. You got to deal with inventory. You got to have a good, support, good return policy. I do a lot of shopping online. In fact, I do way more shopping online than I should. And I don't get hung up on too much details. I understand online shopping, but there's one thing that I will never buy on the store if it doesn't exist, and that's a good return policy, right? Again, not the topics we're going to be talking about here today, but I just want to expose that a little bit to the folks watching. If there's anybody thinking about this, these are the things you want to be considering. A good return policy will make all the difference in converting browsers into buyers and increasing the viability of your products. Now, when it comes to the visual side of things, which is what we're focusing on here today, you want to have images and assets and sales assets and marketing assets to help sell your product. Whether it's photorealistic images, whether we're talking about AR experiences, you name it, right? You know your product, you know how it could sell. You're the only one who knows the kinds of assets you need, but you need assets. You need content. Content is really going to be king. Now, when you start thinking about, that study that I told you about, where people are expecting 8 images on average to represent the product before they will make a purchasing decision, you can start to get overwhelmed if you have hundreds and thousands of SKUs to deal with. And the next kind of point I want to make is really about bringing that in-house, bringing the creation of those assets in-house, and how that's really critical in our opinion. So you could be tempted to, especially if you're a marketplace owner, to leverage assets that are provided by the different manufacturers you work with. The problem that you're going to encounter, just like with this woman here watching Drake in a catalog, that's a drawing of Drake. I think she would be much more convinced to buy Drake if it was an actual photorealistic rendering of Drake. Wouldn't you agree? That's a bit of a strange and very far-fetched parallel, but the point is that when you start taking sales assets and marketing assets from multiple different vendors and manufacturers, what you essentially start creating is an inconsistent shopping experience, where one vendor will provide you with photorealistic, renderings, super high quality. The other is going to provide you subpar, sub-quality photographs. One might provide you with sketches or images, and one might provide you with a CAD model. You deal with it, right? So it starts to get a little bit hairy and cumbersome. You really want to bring those expertise in-house. You really want to own the creation of those assets to create a much more consistent shopping experience. It makes all the difference, and it really helps increase the viability of your products. But not only that, it helps avoid things like brand erosion, right? Your name is on this website, or your company's name is on this website. You want to make sure that when customers come, not only do they return, but they don't leave with a sour taste in their mouth. And lots of things go into this. Again, we're talking about the visual aspect of this, but it's not just the visual aspect. We really want to make that super clear. There's a lot of things that go into making a successful e-commerce campaign. And of course, you retain full creative control of what your online shopping experience looks like, feels like, and the experience of it. So, of course, I'm leading you down the path of going digital. That's what this is all about, right? So I use 3ds Max. I'm a big 3ds Max user, and I believe 3ds Max to be the tool of choice for the e-commerce space when creating digital representations of the products you sell. Now, the first, obviously, if you think about the main 2 ways of creating assets, you can photograph them or you can digitize them. And at the end of the day, digitization costs way less than photography. That's like, just from a cost-effective, cost efficiency, cost savings point of view, hands down, going 3D makes a lot more sense. Think about this chair. You want to photograph it. You got to bring it into a photo shoot. You got to bring the professionals to do the actual photo shoot. You got to take multiple pictures, pick the ones you want, put them on your website. What happens if you have 3 fabrics to deal with. You got to bring this in every single time. What about if you have 8 or God forbid 100 different fabrics? And today, when you go online and you shop furniture, I mean, every furniture's got dozens and dozens and dozens of fabrics to choose from. This starts to get hairy, complex, and super expensive. The scalability of this is just impossible. Think about objects that have different configurations or permutations. Oftentimes, when you go on a website now, you'll be able to configure a product with all the different combinations that exist. Doing this with a physical photo shoot is just nearly impossible. I mean, there's just no way to encompass everything. Localization is another really good point. If you build a product for one market, it needs to be built slightly different for a completely different market. So tearing that down, building that up back up again starts to get really, really expensive. Another really good point that Bruno brought up last week when we were discussing all this, I thought that was interesting, is if you are, for example, a countertop maker, and you want to do a photo shoot of some granite countertops that have just arrived in your facility, well, you got to cut those countertops, you got to install them on a kitchen, you got to build the kitchen, you got to photograph that kitchen, and what do you do with that countertop after? You throw it away. It's not usable anymore. You can't sell it anymore. So this is, doing a grounded countertop photo shoot in 3D is free. It's just a texture. So think about that for a second. A lot less waste and a lot less time spent building this stuff out. Of course, you get photographic quality with 3D. And one of the more recent realities that I thought was kind of interesting when I read about this is, you know, a year and a half ago, when we were talking about digitization for e-commerce, it was kind of a nice to have. The main sort of benefit was really cost savings, and we could really only talk about cost savings. But in today's reality, with social distancing laws kind of all over the world, you can't even actually create photo shoots, or if you do, they're really difficult to get up and running. I mean, you got to follow social distancing laws. It's just, generally speaking, physical photo shoots today are really difficult to do. So what was once reserved as just a kind of a niche use case in the world of e-commerce is now at the center, and it's what's facilitating and allowing for this, the e-commerce itself to kind of breathe and be successful. All right, so this brings us to 3ds Max. So what is 3ds Max? I'm assuming some of you on the call know what this product is. If you don't know what it is, we're considering Max the Swiss Army knife of 3D or content creation. It's part of every collection that we sell for all the different industries that Autodesk plays in. So of course, the entertainment industry, the manufacturing industry, and the architectural and engineering industry. If we look at the value of Max, we really split it into 2 kind of main sort of categories. There's really everything that has to do with creating photorealistic renderings, whether it's stills or animation, and whether that's for architectural viz, creating game trailers for Ubisoft, or creating visual effects for the next blockbuster movie. Max can allow you to create those stunningly photorealistic shots, again, whether it's stills or fully fledged animations. That's kind of one use case, rendering, right? Photorealistic rendering. The other use case is around everything that has to do with real time. So Max is not a real-time application. When you want to create a real-time experience, you're going to always go through a game engine, something like Unity and Unreal. But the content that is published into that game engine, that the game engine that feeds the game engine, comes from a product like 3ds Max. So whether you're creating, the next AAA game from Ubisoft or from Rockstar, or you're creating an online configurator, or you're creating an AR experience to visualize and interpret, the piece of furniture you're selling in someone's house, all of that needs to eventually, or at one point or another, make its way into a product like 3ds Max. So we facilitate real-time workflows through 3ds Max. If we bring this specifically to product design and how this relates back into e-commerce, the workflow looks a little bit like this. You design in a CAD application, Inventor, Fusion, or SolidWorks. You bring that into 3ds Max. Those models can come in. Max can consume design data from pretty much any application that's out there. From here, you're going to modify the model a little bit. You might even rebuild it from scratch in some cases, using the CAD model as a reference. You're going to edit some mesh. You're going to do some mesh cleanups. Then we're going to start assigning some materials and some finishes. Max has exhaustive capabilities for creating materials from all sorts of types. And then you're going to start maybe lighting it up and creating some mood with some image-based lighting or some studio light rigs. And you're going to render those out in, your favorite rendering application, Arnold, Corona, Redshift, V-Ray, you name it, right? That's for creating the photorealistic assets. There's also the other component, which is preparing the content for real-time consumption. This is where we start talking about things like texture baking and retopology, where we take those models, push them into a game engine to create real-time and AR applications. as it relates to e-commerce. This is pretty much what we're going to be looking at here today. This is our guide, so to speak. All right, let's jump right in. So first area of focus is around materials. I think this is the cornerstone of everything that matters in e-commerce, or anything that matters in the representation of a digital asset. So we're going to be taking a look at material setups. What is PBR, physically based renderings? This is kind of a new paradigm that's becoming a standard when it comes to material definitions, primarily because it's tool independent. Pretty much any application can understand the PBR construct, if you will. Material libraries, how to set those up and standardize on those. We're going to look at material IDs, how to split models up into different material IDs so you can assign different materials to those spaces. And then we're going to take a look at substance materials and how those are now consumable inside of 3ds Max. All right, let's jump into our first workflow here. So I set up my scene here. This is my kind of look dev sort of shader test scene, if you will. I have a physical material assigned to this draped fabric object. And we're going to go ahead and just bring in our texture map. So I used an OSL bitmap lookup shader, which you'll see in a second. And I have these texture maps, these 8K texture maps that I found online. I buy libraries of textures. I do that a lot for the demos that I'm working with. So in here we have a texture of a leather PBR kit, if you will. So we have our color texture, we have our displacement, we have our normal, and we have our roughness, which defines basically the look and feel of this leather shader. So we're just going to bring these 3 textures in that we need. We need base, we need roughness, and we need normal. So we're going to plug these guys into the right textures, into the right OSL bitmap lookup nodes. And the reason why we're using OSL bitmap and not our regular standard legacy bitmap shader, there's a reason for that, and I'll show you that in a second. But here we're going to go ahead and connect base to the base input of the physical material. We're going to select plug roughness into the roughness, and we're going to take our normal map, connect it into a normal bump node, and connect that into the bump input of our physical material. We can lay out everything to create a clean slate editor. Now you see the Max viewport is capable of representing in a very high quality way this shader itself. Again, this is just preview the viewport. Once you're ready to render in full ray tracing mode, we can go into Arnold. So the reason why I use the bitmap OSL bitmap shader is because I can now control the UV tiling on all of my textures in one go using this guy. So I'm going to bring in a OSL transform, UV transform, and plug it into the UV coordinates of each texture map. From here now, I can control in one centralized location the tiling and the scaling of this texture. Using the standard Max bitmap, I'd have to go into 3 different bitmaps every time I wanted to change the scaling of this. Not very useful, not very elegant. So one thing that we also can do with 3ds Max is we can create material libraries, again, that we can standardize on. So I'm going to go to the material map browser. I have a little triangle input there that I can go and create a brand new material library. This creates a .mat file. These material libraries, these .mat files can be shared and standardized upon. I just basically drag and drop the output of my physical material directly into that library, and now it lives there. Now, as I make changes to this material, I rename it, I can create multiple variations of this. For example, I'm going to use a color correct shader in order to take my base input, which is the black texture, the black leather texture, and we're going to connect that back into the input of the base input of my physical material. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and just extract the dark areas of my texture and change this to a completely new leather texture, or leather color. And I can just keep doing this and resaving new materials and just keep adding to my material library super easily, right? That's a really great thing about using these color correction shaders and using OSL for this. I can even adjust my index of refraction to lower and tone down a little bit my reflections to create a more realistic looking leather material. Of course, again, this is just preview in the Max viewport, but I can render this in Arnold and it'll look physically accurate and photorealistic. Here's a model that we're working with. And one thing I want to show you is how to deal with material IDs. So this is one mesh. Everything is combined into one mesh, which is usually the case when you import CAD models. Now I want to separate this out into different components that I can then assign different materials to and create colorways, for example. So let's go ahead and just select some. We're going to go into element sub-object mode. You see that right now all of these faces are set to material ID 1. I'm going to go ahead and select multiple components of this. For example, the inner parts of the bag, set it to 2, hit enter. That's now material ID 2. I'm going to grab my handles, set it to 3, and so on and so forth. I'm going to do this to all the parts of my model that have a different look, a different surface finish, a different appearance, whatever it is. I could even do this a little bit more granularly. For example, I want to create an outer black trim. So I'm going to go into edge mode, select those two edges, hit loop, then convert that using the control key into a polygon selection. And now I'm going to give this yet again a different material ID. This is going to be 5. And so now basically I can very easily start assigning materials to this guy as long as I respect those material ID conventions that I defined. In my material library that I created a little bit earlier, you'll notice that I have a whole bunch of new materials that I've created. Again, using the same techniques I showed you earlier. I'm just going to bring this right into my slate editor one by one, populate the whole slate editor. It's a little bit messy, but I'll show you guys how to clean this up and make this a little bit more easy to look at. So we can go into view and we can say hide unused nodes. This basically takes all the inputs of every shader that's not used and hides them and collapses them. They're still there, but I don't see them cluttered in my view. And then I go layout all and everything is kind of, excuse me, kind of clean and easier to look at. Makes your eyes bleed a little bit less. So we're going to use a multi-sub-object material, which is what we need to deal with the model like this, where we have multi-material IDs. We're going to set this to 5 because we know we have 5 material inputs. And now it's just a question of mapping the right material to the right material ID. I have my beige leather set to material ID 1. I have some dark leather. I have some light gray leather, material ID 2. Take my dark gray, put it on material ID 3. And you see it's automatically popping up into the viewport based on the material ID assignment that I did a little bit earlier. That's really how you deal with a model that has multiple different materials on them. And if I show you guys some beauty shots of these are rendered with Arnold. Again, the viewport is just a look dev. It's just a preview. It's real time. It's preview. It's awesome. It's really high quality. But if you want to render and get some assets ready for your website, you want to go through something like Arnold or other render engines. So we also have support for Substance. Substance is really powerful and a really big player in this space. So we can use a new Substance shader that was introduced this year into 3ds Max. We can load in some SPSAR files that are coming directly from Substance. You see that with the Substance node, I can scale this out to get a rich, large thumbnail preview of the shader that I'm working with. In this case here, another leather material. I can preview the different passes that exist in here. So we have our ambient occlusion that was done in Substance, our height maps, if we add roughness, metalness, and of course our normal maps can be viewed. There's 2 ways to use this guy now. We can either break these outputs into texture maps that are basically portable, that any shader and any application can use, right? So when I bake these out, I'm going to create the texture map equivalents. These are high res 8K. Or I can also just tell Max, hey, you know what? Use the Substance shader as is, connected to an Arnold shader, and render with the Substance shader without baking out the inputs. So 2 options at your disposal, depends what your output type is. If you're going into outside of Max, you're going to want to bake those out into textures. But if you're staying within Max for rendering, then you can use the Substance shader as is. Basically just assign this. And when you render this out, next slide. Oh.
So just a quick note about Substance. Yeah. So the rendering team is working very closely with the Substance team. Now the Substance plugin is shipped directly with the Max release. And so you don't need to have a full subscription of, whoa, that's bad, right? You don't need to have a subscription of Substance to be able to use that actually. So there's the, I think you only need you can go a Substance Share, which is the free exchange platform. And you can get, there's hundreds of Substance file that you can get and start using in 3ds Max. So these are procedural materials that you can use. So that was actually a good timing for. That
was a great timing for you to ask that question. For you to make that comment. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I thought you read my mind.
I actually made it crash from the distance.
So this is that Substance, so those Substance shaders that we just brought in, rendered out with Arnold to create photorealistic assets ready for website consumption. All right, so shifting gears a little bit from materials, I want to show you guys how to fully embrace the Max viewport. I showed you how nice it looks, but I didn't show you how to set it up. I want to make sure that you walk away with understanding today that the Max viewport is very capable. So we're going to look at how the Max viewport can produce real-time feedback. We're going to look at some image-based lighting workflows. We're going to see how to simplify material graphs, and also some of the viewport effects that have been brought into this year's release of 3ds Max. So this model of Bose headphones, the first thing you'll notice is that when this was brought in from a separate application, and it comes in with Vera materials, which is great if you want to use Vera. I don't want to use Vera because I don't have Vera. I have Arnold. So I got to convert these and put this into a state that I can actually render with. Just as a side note, and this is totally up to you guys. You guys work in whatever context you want to work in. I like to work in a context where what I'm building is not render specific. I like to work in a render agnostic mode. So whatever I build in Max can be rendered with any game engine, or sorry, any render engine, not just Arnold or V-Ray or Corona. So in Max, we introduced something called the scene converter, which the scene converter allows you to convert from any render engine into any render engine if you're working with Corona or Arnold or V-Ray. In this case here, I'm going to select the V-Ray preset. Excuse me. What it's going to do is it's going to convert all my V-Ray materials, as you see here, into physical materials. So now I'm basically ready. I can render these back into V-Ray if I want, but I'm not stuck in V-Ray, which is what the point I really want to make with this. So now that I'm in a render agnostic state, I'm going to set up my viewport. First thing I'm going to do before doing that is set up some lighting. I want to do some image-based lighting so I can test my shaders out. So I'm going to load in the new OSL HDR environment map that we added this year. And here we can use any one of the provided environment maps that Max is now shipping with. Plug these in and they display in the viewport. And right now we have nothing turned on. So we'll get there in a second. We can edit this guy in SME and we can go ahead and change to a different map. I'm going to use some of the maps that I have on my hard drive. So I'm going to go to a different folder and use some of these guys here. Now, of course, there's lots of things that's wrong right now. One of the things that's wrong is that the background is super pixelated and very blurry. We're going to solve that. By default, Max has very low resolution defined as the default for the viewport. So if you open up your viewport configuration dialog, you can go to the display performance tab and increase the resolution that's defined or allocated to your texture maps and your environment maps. You also want to increase your anti-aliasing. And now we have the background looking much better. Next thing you want to do is turn on high quality mode. So high quality mode, unlike in the past, which just turned on like one or two things, now it turns on like everything you need for a great looking viewport. It turns your shaders into the right shading mode. It enables skylighting. It enables high quality in the viewport itself. It does a lot of things. So as you see, just by turning that on, I start to get a pretty good looking viewport. We can go into the preview presets and start making some changes. I'm not crazy about the skylight flickering on mouse up, so I turned that off. One thing we did add this year is screen space ambient occlusion. So I can turn this on to create those context shadows that were otherwise only available with the progressive skylighting. So turn off progressive skylighting, turn on ambient occlusion, you're in a really good place to visualize your products nicely. You can store all your settings into a preset and come back to this mode after the fact at any moment in time, as you see here. Now moving right along, now that we've set up the viewport to give us the most optimal and high quality results, let's go back and tweak our lighting. So remember we have our HDR loaded into the background. I can turn it in place. I can adjust things like the exposure, tone it up, tone it down. I can add some tint a little bit if I want to colorize my background and my environment map. I can add some contrast. I can also blur the background. I'm not crazy about this setting, so I don't recommend using it. Instead, what I recommend using is your own custom background and loading in a blurry image if you wanted to. Because this is a product shot that I'm making, I want just a static, constant white background. But I still want the environment map to be used to calculate reflections. So I'm splitting the background up from an environment map used to calculate lighting and reflections, and a backplate image, which is just a white swatch to be displayed in the background itself. What's really great is we added a new shader called the HDR Light Shader. This guy allows you to basically not only load a high dynamic range environment map, but also a high dynamic range image of a light itself. And this is basically comped into the background of the environment map. So we're going to bring this in. You see that we're shipping with a few examples. You can get any more online, a whole bunch more online. So let's go ahead and just bring this guy in. What we can do is go to its settings. You can adjust multiple things in here, like the exposure, the tint, and everything. You can create a point helper. And using the point helper and the place highlights feature of 3ds Max, you can basically position that light in space relative to the surface normal that's below the mouse. So think of this like highlights painting, so to speak. Now it's a little bit bright, so I'm going to tone that down. But notice that as I use the place highlights feature, I'm basically orienting the highlight or that light in space to create the highlights that I want. You can add any number of these. You can stack these up. I'm going to grab this orangey kind of light, and I want this to be facing the cups of my headphones in order to create a more warmth effect there. So it's pretty awesome shaders, pretty awesome workflows for product rendering. And of course, this is all done in the viewport, but when you render in Arnold, it's all basically one-to-one. Last step of this process is to set up your camera view and create a final shot. So here we have our headphones. I'm just going to position it into view. Want to make sure your safe frames are on because this is what you're going to be capturing in the render itself. Then we're going to go and create a camera from view. I want to create some depth of field. So when I select the camera and go to its modify panel, I can enable depth of view. Depth of view is based on aperture and target distance. So what is in focus will be wherever your target is. So you want to make sure you adjust your target to be located where you want to focus. And your aperture defines how blurry things are outside of that focus and how wide of a focus you have. So you can create the exact shot you want like this. Once you're ready to capture the viewport, if your viewport is what you want, you can go ahead and hide certain things from the viewport, like your lights, your cameras, and your helpers. These are just hidden from view. They still act and behave. They're just not visible in the viewport. And then you can go into the tools menu, go into the grab preview, and grab basically a screen capture, or you can out of any resolution, or you can just do a screen cap of your scene. And you can also throw this at Arnold or V-Ray or any other render engine to create a more photorealistic version of this render. One of the things we added in this release, this last release of 3ds Max, is support for bloom in the Max viewport. Again, this is more of a gamey feature, but I still wanted to show it because it's really sexy. If you are at all looking at the viewport as a way to create final assets and you want to create some bloom, we now have access to that in the Max viewport, as you see here. Some beauty shots of these. These are actually inspired by an ad campaign that I saw for the Bose headphones. Another example of another kind of model, another CAD model that was brought into Max and visualized in the viewport. Sorry for that glitch. Super high quality, looks really, really nice. Like the Max viewport is really capable these days. Okay, another topic we're going to cover next, we're going to shift gears a little bit, is talk a little bit about virtual photography, and it's the ability to create virtual sets and virtual photo shoots, all digitally without ever having any human intervention except for the artist creating this. And so this revolves a lot around high quality rendering. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So we have our chair model here. We're going to go ahead and just create a camera from which we'll be viewing the model. And from here, we basically adjust the camera view. And we're going to go ahead and just create an Arnold light. It's a point light. We're going to create a 3-point lighting scheme. This is going to be rendering our scene. Now, when we hit the render button, it's all black. The reason is because our lights are not bright enough. So we're going to go ahead and go to the light itself, increase on the light object, increase the intensity and the exposure to bring that lighting into our scene. Now we have these super hard shadows, and this might be the look you're after because it's actually kind of nice. But if you want to create some soft shadows, what you're going to do is convert your light into an area light, or what we call a quad light. And you want to make sure that you have enough of a size. The bigger the size of the quad light, the more soft your shadows will be. With soft shadows comes noise. Excuse me. And so to remove that noise without increasing your render times dramatically is to increase the sampling of the lights objects themselves. And you see how that cleaned up that noise, and the render times were identical. From here, you can do any number of changes to your lights. You can add some warmth. Maybe make it a little bit cooler. Here we're going to create a copy of the light to create our light on the right-hand side. This one's going to be a little bit cooler to contrast the warmth coming in from the left. And you start to see how we can build this guy up. I'll forward this a little bit because it gets a little bit long-winded, but we're creating basically a 3-point lighting perspective. What's really neat in Max is you have the light lister. This is basically a centralized location for all of your lights, where you have all the lights listed in your scene and all the main parameters. So if you want to do some light adjustments or some light balancing, you can do all that right here.
That's a beautiful render.
Sorry?
Who made that? Who made that beautiful
image? Who made
image?
that beautiful image? One last little workflow here before I pass it on to Bruno is oftentimes, so now you've rendered your model, it's got, with lights and everything's looking great, but you're going to want to take this guy and put it over a white background. It's typically how products are sold online, especially single products. So to do that, it's really quick. We're going to use something called the matte shadow shader inside of 3ds Max. And we're going to apply this to the geometry around our chair. Remember, we have this whole kind of world around it. And what that does basically is it makes that geometry invisible, but it captures shadows and reflections and things like that. So right now it's invisible, so it's seeing the world around it, and the world is black. So we need to make the world white. And we can do that by going into the Arnold settings, go to the environment, custom color, set it to white. And now we have the same lighting from previously, but over a completely static white background. You can add something like the Arnold properties modifier if you want a little bit more control over how this white environment is behaving. Was it capturing, is it casting lighting? Is it seen in reflections, things like that. So you can tweak those things from this. But at the end of the day, what you're generating is an image that looks, an image with an alpha channel that you can use to then comp this onto any other photograph or any other, source, right? So you're cutting out your chair and your model and your product along with the shadows that it's casting. So with this, I'm going to pass the puck to Bruno.
You're passing me the puck, but you're not passing me the control. So it's going to be a bit weird because you're going to need to be the one like pausing this.
I'm controlling this. I got you.
Okay, so I want to talk a bit about interactive rendering. So that's the viewport. So I have the PS5 controller in all of its glory because I was not able to find one. So I decided to play with it in 3D. So what we've added in recently with Arnold is the Arnold render view. So that's the Arnold frame buffer. So in this case, I'm running an interactive session. As you can see, it's kind of a bit choppy. So what I'm gonna do to make it a bit more responsive, I'm just gonna switch to the test resolution because I think it's probably like a 1080 image. So right now, by using like a lower resolution, it's gonna be way more faster. Here I'm exposing some of the render elements. So in Arnold, it's called AOV. So if you wanna, kind of do some diagnosis and look only at your reflection or something like that on your image, look at the diffuse, you have access to all of this directly in the frame buffer. Continue this. So next, there's a kind of a very useful tool called isolation. So in this case, once I'm enabling the isolation mode, I can select any object, or in this case, I'm selecting only a specific light. So I'm going to see only the contribution of that specific light to the rendering. Next one is of course, the region rendering. That's kind of a classic. So it's kind of useful because once it's rendering, you can move it around, so you can kind of paint on your rendering, but you can also resize it to kind of have a proper region to do some work like this. So again, using the isolation mode, I'm kind of isolating only one of the joysticks, so I can work really, for example, on the reflection or the roughness only for that joystick. So next part, of course, snapshot, kind of useful. So let's say in this situation, I'm kind of testing different lighting scenarios, modifying some of the intensity of my lights. So I can add comments and do, create a bunch of snapshots with some annotation. We do have a set of what we call debugging shaders. So these are useful if you want to do some diagnostic on your image. For example, here, I just want to work on my lighting. I want to kind of validate if my model is kind of okay. Using just the occlusion, I can see the wireframe, normals, UV. So there's a couple of different modes that you can use to kind of work on your validate some stuff on your model. Again, here working only on the lighting on my scene, so I can kind of fine tune the lighting. Some post effect, not much yet, so you can tweak the exposure, and that's about it for this video, right? So next slide was the kind of final image that I've produced of my soon to, one day I'm gonna have one PS5. Yeah.
All right, so time is not our friend today, so we're gonna kind of just keep going here because we have a few more concepts to cover. And again, my apologies if it's going a little bit fast, but we do want to make sure we cover all this material with you here today. Next topic is, I think, one of the most important topics when it comes to e-commerce, and that's about the ability to repurpose your assets and reuse them for multiple different target platforms. So we're going to be looking at how to create portable 3D models and portable assets. We're going to be looking at how to deal with scan geometry and also how to prep your model for outputting into a mobile experience. First point I want to make here is if you want to go, very high level here, if you want to go from your CAD product and you go into AR, VR, it's not recommended to do that. I mean, some products will allow you to do that, but this is not what you should be doing. There's way too much information on the CAD model. It's way too dense, way too complex, and it's really not real-time friendly. Instead, what you should be doing is taking that product and bringing it into a product like 3ds Max and prepping it and massaging it and getting it ready for real-time consumption. When it comes to preparing your model for different output platforms, it's all about LODs, or levels of details, or what I call variants, right? So you go from a high resolution model and you create multiple different variants of different resolutions that are suitable for different platform needs, right? And this is what we're going to cover in this next section. This is what Max allows you to do really nicely. This particular video was done before one of the more recent tools was released, so I won't play it all back. It's on my YouTube channel if you want to see it, but it's basically how to model using some push and pull techniques to create low resolution versions of high resolution geometry. So if you're at all curious, I'll kind of just go to the end here. These three models look identical, but one is super high res, and then the lowest one is like 900 faces, right? But they look virtually identical. So if you want to see how this is built, like I said, go to my YouTube channel. I'm going to spend time on this particular workflow here, which covers a lot of what we just showed and a lot more. So this is a scan geometry, a scan model that I want to use, and I want to clean it up and I want to use it properly, right? It's a lot of triangles, lots of information for no reason. First thing you'll notice when you get close to it is it's very faceted. So I want to make sure that I clean that up using the smooth modifier, using auto smooth. We'll clean up all those faceted edges and create nice geometry from there. From here, we're going to start talking about shading this guy. In Max, this is one of the latest releases of Max. We introduced something called the PBR importer. The PBR importer allows you to navigate to a folder on disk that contains any number of PBR textures. And based on rules that I define, automatically import those in and create the material graphs necessary. You see that we have two materials in here that this system detected. Metal and wood, and all the different inputs that it's detected there. And how those are defined is basically based in this settings tab. So you can modify this and adapt this to your own pipeline needs. So here I'm going to bring these two in. I'm going to define what type of material am I going to create, either PBR material or a physical material. Hit create, and it creates those material graphs for me automatically. If I had 100 of these, it would create 100 materials, right? So in this case here, I want to use the beat up metal shader. I'm going to assign this directly to my my mask here on my tiger. I'm going to lower the specularity so I can understand how these textures are mapping to my model. And you see that we have some stretching, we have some skewing. We want to solve this. So traditionally, you'd add a UV map modifier. You'd probably try to tweak this. It's a little bit depressing and hard to work with. No matter what you do, you have stretching, set yourself to box mode. It does a better job, but you're still going to have some seams and some stretching that you're going to want to get rid of. Instead, what we're going to do is scrap all this and use triplanar mapping. Max has a triplanar shader called the blended box shader, which allows you to blended box map shader, which is render agnostic, right? Allows you to project images from 1, 3, or 6 sides. In this case here, we have one image we want to project. So we're going to project it from all sides. Using the control key, you can inject that node into a graph, into a line connection. Holding the control key directly from the material map browser, I can drag and drop it in, and it connects directly into a connection line. Set these all to one projection. And basically, once I'm satisfied, I hit the layout all to clean this all up and create a nice looking graph. And now if you tumble around the mask, you'll notice that we've got rid of all of our shade, all of our artifacts, all of our stretching, all of our skewing, because it's basically blending. Wherever this is seen, it blends between the two textures and creates a much more interesting effect. Let's bring back our specularity. You'll notice that I can increase my roughness to bring this back. And it's pretty cool, but it's missing a little bit of love. So we want to create a roughness map. This PBR kit did not come with a roughness map, so I'm going to create my own. I'm going to use the color correction shader that we saw a little bit earlier. And we're going to connect the diffuse output into it and its output into the roughness input. Basically, what we're going to do is take our diffuse map and desaturate it completely to create a black and white image. From here, I can modify my brightness values to create a more specular or less or more rough finish. The lower the values, the more specular, the higher the values, the more kind of rough the surface finishes. But because I'm basing it on a texture map that contains some detail, it's a much more layered, much more textured roughness map than just a static value. So now we're ready to deal with our topology. We're going to go into clay mode for this. I like to go into clay mode to better see my geometry. Because this is a symmetrical model, and what we're going to do next is really process intensive, we want to get rid of half the model, or we want to get rid of the things, parts of the model that are not super necessary. Let's go ahead and just use a slice modifier, get rid of half of that model. We're going to delete those faces using remove top. And then we are going to bring in from here a optimizer model. We want to reduce the complexity of this mesh down to something like 30% while still maintaining the overall volume. Now this created some artifacts. So we're going to go ahead and add a smooth modifier on top of this to smooth that out. Smooth modifier also creates some artifacts, so we can use a weighted normals modifier to clean up those artifacts. Now from here, we're ready to retopologize. This is the brand new tool we added this year in the last release of Max. Now, of course, remember we're dealing with half the mesh, so the polygon budget you give it will be doubled eventually. We don't have any hard edge detection, so we can take that out and we can compute. This model took about 60 seconds to compute locally. This is, of course, sped up a little bit. Now you'll notice some detail was lost, but we're going to regain that detail with texture baking a little bit later. Let's go ahead and just throw in a symmetry modifier to bring back our other half. And next, what we're going to do is just another weighted normals to fix some of those artifacts that we see from the retopologizing. So next we need some UVs. Again, we're opening up our UV editor, just like we did a little bit earlier. We're going to flatten our UVs. Again, this is not a games workflow. If you are intending to use this for actual game engine development, you want to spend time making your UVs. This is purely an e-commerce workflow. So flatten mapping is going to be good enough for what we're trying to do. We're going to make sure that we pack these using the new concave packing method, which will maximize the UV space. And this is good enough for what I'm trying to do. I only want UVs so I can extract the information from my high-res model, right? And all the information that exists on that high-res model. Let's go ahead and open up our texture baking tool. We're going to bring in our standard PBR inputs, our base, our diffuse, basically our metalness, our roughness, and our normal. We want to extract this information from a different model, so we're going to use projection, and we're going to pick our high-res model. A cage appears. This cage can be adjusted, so we can reset the values of the cage, and using the push amount, we can push the cage outwards a little bit, just in order to fully encompass the details of the high-resolution model. From here, we can go ahead and just change our image resolution to 4K. We're going to create a new material, our PBR materials. We're going to connect the right inputs into the right inputs. And we're basically just going to hit bake. Here, you're going to visualize the baked inputs. All the different elements are baking directly inside of the frame buffer. And when I forward this a little bit, you'll see that side by side, high res, low res, scan mesh, clean quad, they look identical. But when you look at the mesh, they're anything but identical. And this is because we captured all that detail. We have clean quads with retopology, and we captured all those details with retopo, with the texture baking, I should say. And you can create any number of these LODs for any number of target platforms. And last but not least, before I pass it on to Bruno, this is an example, again, more of a consumer product. Same workflow, right? We have a high-res, super detailed version, low-res, just texture maps, super portable. This is just a physical material with texture inputs. This can be sent into any DCC application, or any game engine can consume this, or even if you wanted to go into WebGL, you can use GLTF using the Babylon exporter. And by the way, someone asked yesterday if we were working on our own GLTF exporter and importer, and the answer is yes. I can't tell you when or give you any details. If you want to ask Brent, who's on this call right now, he may be able to provide some details. His team is working on that, but yes, we are working on our own GLTF support. And then you can take that, bring it into an AR application, and visualize your content online. And even Drake's super impressed with what he can buy online these days.
Wow.
Okay, more examples of AR, right? So people are getting really creative on how they can leverage AR to increase the viability of their products. And I'm going to pass it to Bruno to close it off. Sorry.
Thanks. So I have 5 minutes. No,
10 minutes.
go back to the previous slide. So it's important. So what you're about to see is not in product. Don't make any purchasing decision on what you're about to see. Everything we're about to show is prototype, beta, alpha stuff. So please don't make any purchasing decision. I could get in trouble. We can lose our job. So please be kind. So I want to just show you a couple of things that my team has been working on in the last few weeks and months. So we're working on a material library. So just before we start, so we used to have a material library shipping with Max, bunch of texture, different size. We were kind of bloating an installer with a bunch of not so pretty texture that you might never use actually. So what we're deciding to do with this, instead of bloating an installer with a bunch of texture that you might never use, we are hosting that whole library online. So again, this is beta. I've made that video with the build that I've kind of picked last night. So it's very prototypey, but everything is web hosted. So the goal is you go on you use the library, you go on the cloud, you just browse and get the material that you need when you need it. So you can actually change category. There's about 100 materials so far. We can duck that window because it's all Qt based, but the whole content is web hosted. So right now I'm clicking on any of these. I'm get different swatches with details about that materials, and I can download it. Again, I'm downloading only what I need. So I'm getting some progress download like this, and I get some notification once that material is available. So I have my home section at the top. So that means that all those material in that category are actually on disk and I can use them. So once my material is, if you can just pause a bit. So once the material is available on disk, I can actually assign it to one of my object in my scene. So in this case, I have the wooden floor, I just apply it to my floor. So you can continue. So going in the wall category, I'm gonna pick one of those wall materials and assign it to in my scene like this. All right. So again, like easily, I can just browse the library. Right now, it's not like a big exhaustive library, but that's something that we're working on. And important thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but everything is based on Material X, which is a new open standard. So we decided to not do something that was tailored for Max, tailored to a specific renderer, but made something that was open and can be used by in any kind of situation. So in this case, I've kind of opened that middle shader in my Slate editor, and I'm seeing it as a physical material. So it's kind of the transport file format is Material X, but it's kind of seamless in Max. So in this case, again, the floor material is loaded as a physical material with a couple of OSL nodes to load all of those texture. So once it's done, so I've shaded that whole scene, small basic scene, but I was able to create like multiple variation of the same bathroom by using materials from the library. Again, this is in beta. This is kind of in progress, but it's getting quite interesting. So next part is, so speaking of Material X, we're working on Material X IO, so to be able to consume Material X and Max, render them, and also export them. So in this case, I'm taking a physical material that I've made in Max, and I'm exporting it to a Material X file. So in this case, I'm loading it in Material X View, which is a Material X viewer, and I can see exactly the same materials that I add in Max in my Material X viewer. So taking this a bit further, so we're working along with other folks, in the M&E group at Autodesk. So we're working on what we call LookDevX. So LookDevX is a new environment to author and to create Material X. So it's kind of a new material editor that we're working with the Maya team. So right now this is working standalone. So it's working outside of Max. And so that's kind of the future that we're kind of hoping to get for material editing with 3ds Max. So right now I'm adding just a new color correct node, and I'm kind of plugging this one back in my material. So I'm kind of affecting the saturation and the color of my metal material. So again, this is very prototypey, but that's something that we are working on. And the next one is probably the coolest one. So I've shown this a bit earlier. So this is Arnold Render View. So we are consolidating a bunch of, there's already some post-processing tool available that are working with Arnold in 3ds Max, but we are kind of gathering everything right into Arnold View like this. So user will be able to do some artistic direction and post-processing right into Arnold View like this. So here I'm adding what we call imagers. So I can create a stack of different operators, if you will, that will kind of do some post-processing on my image. So in this case, I'm changing the white balance of the image while it's still rendering. So I'm doing some basic editing like this. So I can add different, what we call imagers again. So I can create a stack of different operators that will kind of change the look of my image. So this one, I'm doing some color correct. I'm gonna add another one to kind of tweak the exposure of my image. And these one can be actually, you can edit those imagers while you are still rendering. So here I'm gonna add two other ones, so one for denoising and the other one is for lens effect. So these two you need to wait to have kind of the final frame before you're actually gonna see the effect of it, because the denoising will kind of remove some artifact on the image once it's completed. So if we look closely, you'll see that if I turn off that modifier or that imagers, the noise is kind of coming back. And for the lens effect, there's some vignetting, of course, but we also added some bloom. So if you want to add some crazy bloom effect on your PS5 controller like this, well, you can do so. And the next one is quite interesting. So we've added another imager for light mixing. Is it on pause?
Oh, sorry.
No, it's not. Okay.
Mhm.
All right, so I'm removing the two previous one and I'm adding the light mixer imager. So in this one, I'll see at the bottom all my, what we call light group in Arnold. So if I open my light group manager like this, so on the left, I have all the lights in my scene and I kind of group them depending on what kind of, post-processing I want to do with this image. When I actually light that scene, I have a IBL for the environment and I have a bunch of light that I just kind of, put randomly. The intensity is quite random. I think everything is at 10, then I can do all the post-processing after that while my image is rendering. So in this case, I can turn off everything. So technically everything will be black because no lights are actually contributing to my scene. So this one is my environment. So that's the HDR that I've used for the background. And I can change the tint, of course, the intensity, the exposure. So I can do this with all my individual light groups. So change the intensity, change the exposure and the tint. So you can really kind of tweak your image and it kind of gives you more artistic control to create some different variation or lighting scenarios. So here I'm using, of course, a product, but it could be an interior image, interior scene. So you could create like, night shot or daylight kind of image. I think this is it. Is it? Next image?
I think this is it.
Yeah. So these are a couple of variations that I've created just by using different imagers and post-processing effect. And we made it. 3 minutes over. That's not too bad.
That's about. That's
So
about.
please follow us. So Jose is a bit more active than I am on YouTube. So if you want to look at additional videos and tutorial, I do have a few as well. Follow us on our journey with our hashtag 3ds Max friends, of course. If you want to try any of these new feature upcoming with Max and Arnold, please either reach out to me. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. You can also be on the 3ds Max beta. It's open for everyone. So on behalf of me and Jose, thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you guys very
attending.
much. Just a quick reminder, this was recorded, so you will have access to the recording. Sorry for going over 4 minutes. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, Bruno, for participating here today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Brent, as well.
Yeah, and Brent, yes, Brent, I forgot Brent was here. Absolutely.
No problem.
Thanks, guys. And with that, we're going to close it out. And that's it. See you on the next webinar.